It was a cold January morning in London, the kind where even the most seasoned city dwellers tucked their scarves tighter and walked briskly to escape the biting chill. For Arthur Bennett, a royal guard stationed at Buckingham Palace, the cold was simply another element to endure. Dressed in his iconic scarlet tunic and bearskin hat, Arthur stood motionless at his post, embodying the stoic discipline that centuries of tradition demanded. Tourists milled around the palace gates, their chatter blending with the distant hum of London traffic. Cameras clicked incessantly as visitors posed for photos, some attempting to provoke a reaction from the guards. Arthur, like his colleagues, maintained an unflinching gaze, his training rendering him impervious to the antics. Yet, even amidst the usual spectacle, something unusual caught his eye. A man stood at the edge of the crowd, a figure distinctly out of place. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a wiry frame wrapped in a tattered overcoat. His face was weathered, marked by deep lines that spoke of hardship and time, but it was the medals pinned haphazardly to his coat that truly drew Arthur's attention. Military honors, tarnished but unmistakable, glinted faintly in the weak sunlight. The man's eyes darted around nervously, and his lips moved as though reciting a silent mantra. Arthur's instincts, honed during his years of military service before joining the Royal Guard, flared. There was something off about the man's demeanor, a restlessness that spoke of more than just discomfort. The way his hands clenched and unclenched, the slight tremor in his posture all hinted at a man on edge. Hours passed, and the man lingered, occasionally shifting position but never straying far from the gates. Arthur's gaze flicked to him periodically, his curiosity and concern growing. The man avoided eye contact with the crowd but seemed to glance at Arthur with a strange mix of recognition and desperation. The tourists, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension, continued their routines. As the time approached for the changing of the guard, the crowd thickened, pressing closer to the gates for a better view. The ceremony, a meticulously rehearsed display of precision and tradition, began with the arrival of the relief guards. Arthur's focus returned to his duties, his movements precise and measured as he marched alongside his comrades. Just as the ceremony reached its midpoint, a commotion erupted near the edge of the crowd. A sharp cry rang out, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the pavement. Arthur turned his head slightly, enough to catch sight of the man in the overcoat collapsing to the ground. His medals clinked faintly against the stones as his frail body crumpled. The tourists nearest to him gasped, some stepping back in alarm while others pulled out their phones. Arthur's training told him to remain at his post, but the soldier in him couldn't ignore the scene unfolding. His superior, positioned nearby, gave a subtle nod, granting Arthur silent permission to act. Breaking formation, Arthur moved swiftly toward the man, his long strides cutting through the crowd. As he approached, he noticed the man clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain. Kneeling beside him, Arthur removed his bearskin hat, placing it gently on the ground as he assessed the situation. "Sir, can you hear me?" Arthur asked, his voice calm but firm. The man's eyes fluttered open and he gasped for breath, his words barely audible. They're coming," the man rasped, his gaze darting around wildly. Arthur frowned, unsure of what he meant. The man's hand shot out, gripping Arthur's wrist with surprising strength. "Help me," he pleaded. "Please." A nearby tourist, a young woman with a first aid kit in her bag, knelt down and offered it to Arthur. "I'm a nurse," she said. "I can help." Arthur nodded gratefully and stepped back slightly, allowing her to assess the man's condition. As the nurse worked, Arthur's attention shifted to the man's belongings. Beside him lay a worn leather satchel, its contents partially spilled onto the pavement. Among the scattered items, Arthur noticed a folded photograph. He picked it up, his heart sinking as he recognized the faces in the picture. It was a younger version of the man, dressed in full military uniform, standing proudly beside a woman and a child. The back of the photograph bore a handwritten note. "To Dad, with love. Come home safe." The nurse looked up at Arthur, her expression grim. "He's having a cardiac episode. We need to get him to a hospital immediately." Arthur nodded and turned to the crowd. "Someone call an ambulance," he commanded, his voice cutting through the murmur of onlookers. Several people scrambled to comply, their phones already dialing. As they waited, the man's grip on Arthur's wrist tightened. "They'll find me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I can't let them." Arthur leaned closer, trying to make sense of the man's fragmented words. "Who's coming? What are you talking about?" The man's eyes filled with tears as he struggled to speak. "They think I know too much from my time overseas." His breathing grew more labored, and his words began to slur. "The file in the satchel. Protect it." Arthur's gaze shifted to the satchel once more. Carefully, he retrieved it, securing the contents inside. Whatever secrets the man carried, they were clearly important enough to put his life at risk. Arthur's military instincts told him this was more than just the ramblings of an ill man. There was danger here, and it was closing in fast. The distant wail of sirens signaled the ambulance's arrival. Paramedics pushed through the crowd, quickly taking over as they loaded the man onto a stretcher. Arthur handed them the satchel, ensuring it stayed with him. Before the ambulance doors closed, the man reached out one last time. "Promise me," he begged, his voice a desperate whisper. "Don't let them take it." Arthur met his gaze, nodding solemnly. "I promise." As the ambulance sped away, Arthur stood in the middle of the crowd, the weight of the man's words heavy on his shoulders. Whatever lay ahead, he knew this day was far from over. The ambulance's sirens faded into the distance, but Arthur Bennett remained rooted in place, his mind racing with the man's cryptic words. The crowd around Buckingham Palace began to disperse, their curiosity satisfied, but Arthur felt an urgency pulling him away from his duties. He glanced toward his commanding officer, who had been observing the scene from a distance. With a curt nod, the officer dismissed him from his post, granting Arthur the freedom to investigate further. Arthur walked briskly toward the staff quarters, his ceremonial uniform drawing lingering stares. Once inside, he changed into civilian clothes, a simple wool coat and scarf, and grabbed his phone. The satchel he had retrieved from the veteran's side sat on the desk, its leather worn but sturdy. Arthur hesitated for a moment before unbuckling the straps and peering inside. The contents were sparse but telling. A few faded photographs, a small notebook filled with scrawled handwriting, and a sealed envelope marked with the words "Top Secret." Arthur's pulse quickened. The envelope bore the insignia of a military intelligence division, one he recognized from his own service. Whatever this man had been guarding, it wasn't trivial. Arthur carefully unfolded the notebook. The handwriting was uneven, as though written in haste, but he could make out fragmented sentences. "Operation Harbinger, classified movements, threats from within. They know I have it. Can't trust anyone. Contact Brigadier Morris, whose last hope." Arthur's brow furrowed. The name stirred a memory. Brigadier Edward Morris had been a high-ranking officer during Arthur's time in the Army, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and unwavering commitment to duty. If this veteran trusted Morris, then perhaps he could shed light on the situation. A sudden knock at the door snapped Arthur out of his thoughts. He froze, his instincts sharpening. Visitors were rare in the guards' quarters, especially unannounced ones. Quietly, he slipped the satchel into a cupboard and approached the door, his hand resting on the knob. "Who is it?" Arthur called, keeping his voice steady. There was a pause, followed by a muffled reply. "Delivery for Mr. Bennett." Arthur frowned. He hadn't ordered anything. Peering through the peephole, he saw a man in a courier's uniform holding a small package. Something about the man's stance seemed off. Too rigid, too deliberate. Arthur's military instincts screamed a warning. "Leave it on the step," Arthur said, his tone firm. The man hesitated, then placed the package down and walked away, his movements unusually measured. Arthur waited until the footsteps faded before opening the door. He picked up the package carefully, examining it. It was light, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. Unease prickled at his skin. Setting the package down on the table, Arthur unwrapped it cautiously. Inside was a single slip of paper with a typed message. "You have something that doesn't belong to you. Return it, or there will be consequences." Arthur's grip tightened on the note. Whoever these people were, they knew he had the satchel, and they weren't going to wait long. He needed to act. Arthur's first priority was locating Brigadier Morris. A quick search on his phone revealed that Morris had retired several years ago and was now living in a quiet suburb just outside the city. Arthur scribbled down the address and grabbed the satchel. Every second felt critical. London streets were alive with activity as Arthur navigated through the city, the weight of the satchel slung over his shoulder. He opted for public transport, knowing it would be harder to track him in the crowds. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every glance over his shoulder revealed unfamiliar faces, but none lingered long enough to confirm his suspicions. At last, Arthur arrived in the suburban neighborhood, a stark contrast to the bustling city center. The streets were lined with modest houses, their gardens neatly kept despite the winter chill. Morris's address led him to a small brick house with a blue door. Arthur approached cautiously, scanning the surroundings for anything unusual. He knocked firmly. Moments later, the door opened, revealing a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through Arthur. Despite his civilian attire, Brigadier Morris exuded the air of a man who was always prepared for action. "Arthur Bennett," Morris said, his voice gravelly but warm. "Haven't seen you since Kandahar. What brings you here?" Arthur wasted no time. "Sir, I need your help. There's a veteran in trouble and it's tied to something bigger. He mentioned your name and gave me this." He held out the satchel. Morris's expression darkened as he took the satchel and examined its contents. When he reached the top-secret envelope, his jaw tightened. "Where is this veteran now?" Morris asked. "He's in the hospital," Arthur replied. "But before he collapsed, he said someone was after him. I think they're after this." Morris nodded grimly. "You're right. Operation Harbinger was a covert mission, one that uncovered corruption at the highest levels of military command. If this information gets out, it could expose a lot of powerful people." Arthur's stomach sank. "And now they're trying to bury it." "Exactly," Morris said. "If they know you have this, you're in danger. We both are." A sudden noise outside made them both freeze, the faint crunch of gravel underfoot. Morris moved to the window, peeking through the curtains. His face hardened. "We've got company," he said. "Black SUV, tinted windows. They're not here to talk." Arthur's training kicked in. "Do you have a back exit?" Morris nodded. "This way." The two men moved swiftly through the house, Morris grabbing a small handgun from a drawer as they passed. They exited through a narrow alley behind the property, sticking to the shadows. The sound of car doors opening and footsteps echoed behind them. "We need to split up," Morris whispered. "They're after the satchel. Take it and head to this address." He handed Arthur a scrap of paper. "It's a safe house. I'll lead them away." Arthur hesitated. "Sir, I can't just leave you." Morris gave him a stern look. "That's an order, Bennett." "Go reluctantly." Arthur nodded and slipped away, clutching the satchel tightly. As he disappeared into the night, he heard the sound of raised voices and footsteps pursuing Morris. The stakes had just risen, and Arthur knew there was no turning back now. Arthur Bennett moved through the dimly lit streets of London, the satchel slung securely over his shoulder. Every nerve in his body was on high alert, the night's events flashing through his mind like a reel of chaos. Morris had diverted the pursuers, but Arthur knew it was only a matter of time before they caught up. His destination, the safe house scribbled on the scrap of paper, was several blocks away. He clutched the satchel tighter, vowing to see this mission through. The city was quieter now, the hustle of the day replaced by the muted hum of late-night traffic. Arthur's footsteps echoed off the cobblestones as he navigated through narrow alleys and side streets. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the occasional passerby. The address Morris had given him led to a nondescript building nestled between a closed pub and a boarded-up shop. Its windows were dark, and the paint on the door was peeling. Arthur hesitated for a moment before knocking 3 times as Morris had instructed. The door creaked open slightly, revealing a pair of sharp eyes that studied him carefully. After a moment, the door swung open wider, and a woman in her 40s stepped aside to let him in. She was tall and lean, with an air of authority that reminded Arthur of his former commanding officers. "You must be Bennett," she said, locking the door behind him. "I'm Claire." Morris called ahead. Arthur nodded, his grip on the satchel unwavering. "Is this place secure?" "As secure as it gets," Claire replied. "Come on, we don't have much time." She led him through a narrow hallway into a small, sparsely furnished room. A single table and 2 chairs occupied the center, and a laptop sat open, its screen displaying an encrypted communication program. Claire gestured for him to sit. "Morris said you have something important," she said, her tone brisk. "Let's see it." Arthur placed the satchel on the table and opened it, pulling out the top-secret envelope and the notebook. Claire's eyes narrowed as she examined the documents. She flipped through the notebook, her expression growing more serious with each page. "This is bigger than I thought," she muttered. "Operation Harbinger. I've heard whispers about it, but nothing concrete. If what's in here is true, it could bring down half the military's upper echelon." Arthur leaned forward. "What do we do with it?" Claire's fingers hovered over the laptop keyboard. "We get it to the right people. There are still a few honest folks left in the government who can act on this. But first we need to upload the files to a secure server. Once it's out there, they won't be able to bury it." As Claire began typing, Arthur's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his heart sinking as he saw the caller ID, Morris. "Morris, are you okay?" Arthur asked, his voice low. "For now," Morris replied, his voice strained. "But they're closing in. I've led them away from you, but it won't hold for long. You need to finish this, Bennett, whatever it takes." "I will," Arthur promised. The line went dead, leaving Arthur with a sense of foreboding. He turned back to Claire, who was focused intently on the screen. "We're almost there," she said. "Just a few more minutes." Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the building, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Arthur's blood ran cold. They had found him. "They're here," he said, rising to his feet. "How do we hold them off?" Claire pulled a pistol from a drawer and handed it to him. "There's only one way in or out. We'll have to make our stand here. Cover me while I finish the upload." Arthur nodded, moving toward the hallway. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by muffled voices barking orders. He took cover behind the door frame, his pulse pounding in his ears. The first intruder appeared, dressed in black tactical gear, and Arthur fired a warning shot. The man ducked back, shouting to his comrades. "We just need the files," a voice called out. "Hand them over and no one gets hurt." Arthur's jaw tightened. Not a chance. Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks reverberating through the narrow space. Arthur returned fire, his military training guiding his every move. He aimed carefully, his shots designed to delay rather than kill. Beside him, Claire worked furiously, her fingers flying over the keyboard. 30 seconds, she shouted. Arthur's focus sharpened. He stepped out briefly to fire another round, forcing the intruders to take cover. One of them lobbed a smoke grenade into the hallway, and Arthur pulled back, coughing as the thick fog filled the air. "Claire?" he called. "Almost done," she replied, her voice strained. The smoke began to dissipate, and Arthur heard the telltale click of a weapon being reloaded. He readied himself, his grip steady despite the chaos. Just as the first intruder emerged through the haze, Claire's voice rang out. "It's done. The files are uploaded." Arthur fired one last shot, hitting the man's weapon and forcing him to retreat. He turned and grabbed Claire's arm. We need to go. Now. They moved quickly through the building, exiting through a back door that led into a narrow alley. The sound of sirens in the distance gave Arthur a glimmer of hope. Someone had called the authorities. As they emerged onto the main street, Arthur spotted a black SUV speeding toward them. He pushed Claire behind a parked car, shielding her as the vehicle screeched to a halt. Two men jumped out, their weapons trained on him. Before Arthur could react, another car barreled into the scene, slamming into the SUV and sending the gunman sprawling. The driver's door opened, and Morris stepped out, his face set in a grim expression. "Thought you could use a hand," he said, tossing Arthur a spare magazine. Together, they subdued the remaining attackers as the sound of police sirens grew louder. Within minutes, law enforcement arrived, taking the intruders into custody. Morris, Claire, and Arthur exchanged a brief, relieved glance. The next morning, Arthur stood in front of Buckingham Palace once more, his ceremonial uniform immaculate, despite the exhaustion weighing on him. The satchel and its secrets were no longer his burden to bear. The files had been delivered to trusted authorities, and the veteran who had entrusted him with this mission was reported to be in stable condition at the hospital. As the changing of the guard ceremony commenced, Arthur felt a sense of quiet pride. He had honored the man's trust, protected a truth that needed to be revealed, and upheld the values he had sworn to defend. For a single day, he had been more than just a royal guard. He had been a soldier, a protector, and a beacon of hope.